All right, we're ready to get going. Glad you are here. Hope it's been a good week for you. We are talking about loving our neighbor. And depending on how time goes in the first text that we're going to look at this morning, depending on how time goes on that, I may shift gears. If we finish this passage out quickly enough, I may shift gears and go to some slides that will help us with sort of entering into an idea for next week. And depending on how time goes with that, then we may be able to get through that whole thing as well. So a moment ago, I picked up my Bible and I began to, can you guess what I did if you were in here last week at the end of class? Does anybody want to venture a guess as to what I did? Let me start. I'll give you a hint. I opened my Bible. I was turning to a passage. And what passage did I turn to, do you think? Not everybody at once.
It had that word in it, but I forget.
So I opened to Exodus 13. I did it again. Two people, thank you. Two people texted me this week and said, actually three, because another texted me on last Sunday. So three people in this, whether in this room now or not, three people sent me a text and it said, Genesis 13. Because at the close of class, I kept saying Exodus 13 is where we'd be next week. And I corrected myself and said, I'm sorry, it's not Exodus 13, it's Genesis 13. And then before class ended, I said it again, said Exodus again, re-corrected myself. And I found myself turning, so I said, somebody send me a text during the week and remind me Genesis 13, not Exodus. So thank you for doing that, ha. And, but just a moment ago, I opened to Exodus 13. I have no idea, Brother Paul, why I'm just in love with Exodus 13, apparently. But we're in Genesis 13 this morning. And so I told you that's where we would start off today. This passage, I think, is especially good at giving us a very stark reminder on one way. It's not built this way in this passage, but one way that you and I can and should, not just can, but should, love other people, love neighbor. And so I want to look at it. And it'll probably be fairly obvious as we walk through it pretty quickly here. Beginning in Genesis chapter 13, verse 1, then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, to the south. Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and in gold, and he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai. I have been between Bethel and Ai. So I'm trying to picture that, or I am able to sort of picture the landscape there when I read that. To the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock, the Canaanites and the Perizzites that dwelt in the land. So Abram said to Lot, please, let there be no strife between you and me, between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right, or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go toward Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. And the Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give you and your descendants forever. And I'll make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants would also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. Then Abram moved his tent and went and dwelt by the terebinth tree and Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord. That's Genesis chapter 13. It's a story that many, if not most of you, have already known. It's one that maybe was part of your remembering before, part of an effort by a mom or a dad or a grandma or a grandpa or just a concerned Sunday school teacher in first grade, trying to shape young minds for later young souls. It's something that you learned about God. It's something that you learned about Abraham. Whether you knew it or not, if that's your first exposure, if it was that far back in your life, whether we knew it or not, it was also something about love. It was something about loving anyone. It was something about loving even neighbor. Now, I doubt that Sister so-and-so, when she taught us that in first grade in Sunday school, gave us that. I mean, she gave us the whole thing, but I said she probably did not give us that. She may have glossed over some idea of being unselfish. Maybe that came up in somebody's class. Maybe with mom and dad, again, whoever gave you your first exposure to Genesis 13 and this event. But it's unlikely that most that gave us our first exposure would have given it to us as a part of loving neighbor. For any number of reasons. But it ought to be there. It ought to be in our minds. If you go back to the beginning of the quarter, we talked about love in the agape form, in the agapao emphasis, rather than in an eros romantic emphasis. I saw her across a crowded room and my heart skipped a beat. I may have told you back then, I don't know, in the opening of the quarter, I may have told you about my friend Steve, who is married to Lisa, and they've now been married for probably 30, going on 35 years, probably 33, 34 years now, and have had wonderful children and a wonderful life together and been very successful in a lot of different ways. And I may have told you about the Sunday night when Steve saw her across a crowded room at church on a Sunday night, and she was surrounded by 4 or 5 other young ladies, and so there's a grouping of 5 or 6 young ladies in the back of the auditorium. Just imagine that this could happen tonight. It has happened here over the years with various ones who have now been married 30 years themselves or more. But imagine it happens tonight after the closing prayer with the yak group back there, and some guy says, "Who is that?" And I'm going back there. And he parts the Red Sea and gets right in front of her friends. He doesn't care. I've got to take my shot right now, no matter who's around. This is what Steve did. She was engaged. He didn't know that. She was engaged to another guy at the time who was not there. Good for Steve. And he walked back there and he said, "Excuse me, I won't take long. I got to say it. You are the most beautiful thing I've ever laid eyes on. And I would like to ask you for a date." And she was complimented and appreciative and embarrassed as well and all of that. And the girls around her were embarrassed. And she informed him that she was engaged and all of that. And he said, "I don't care." He said, "So don't go out with me, and you should not if you're engaged." He said, "But if that ever changes, I want you to know." And he gave her contact information for him. "And if that ever changes, I would like to know." And that was that. They've been married 34 years or so now. Okay, that's strong. That eros love is strong. Of course, at the time, he was capturing his mode of living, his income was being, this was out in West Texas, he was a rattlesnake hunter and trapper. So you think walking into a sea of girls and asking somebody for a date was a big deal to him? He's like, listen, I grab rattlesnakes for a living. I'm not scared of 5 other girls standing there, right? But that's strong. But that's not the love most often discussed, as strong as it is. Most often discussed in the New Testament. And it's not brotherly love, phileo. Philadelphia, that's where we get that. It's not that love, though it's strong, and it ought to be. Love your neighbor in this manner, which is a self-sacrificing manner that is seeking their best interest regardless of yours, the convenience, the cost, whatever it may be. It ought to be, this type of example ought to be in our concern on how we love others. Ought to be at the forefront. And so let's look at just a few quick things on this because you know it so well and we've read the entire chapter. So I don't want to go back verse by verse, but just a few key verses and a few key ideas right here. Look at verse 6. Now the land was not able to support them that they dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. Obviously, Scripture is sharing with us that these men had been extremely well blessed to this point in life. What do you do when you've been extremely well blessed? How do you view things? I've been blessed, and I think that means He'll want to bless me again to have the best over here. I've been blessed. I want to recognize that. And so I think that has something to do with the favor with which God views me. And so I'm sure He would want me to have this over here. I've been blessed. And when you're blessed, it's hard to not want to keep that going. It's hard to be satisfied. Of course, Solomon talked about this, did he not? Did Solomon ever write about this? Did Solomon ever say anything about what it's like to have it all? He did. What did he say about that? Here are the words, depending on your translation. He says, "For I denied myself no pleasure." And what did he say about that? It was unfulfilling. But what's human nature? Well, I kind of like to keep, once you've had something, you kind of hate to kind of go back, Once you've had this kind, blessing upon blessing on blessing, you kind of want, I like that. I like this blessing. I like having this stuff or this area or this opportunity or these people or whatever it is. And I hate to I've gotten used to that. I hate to kind of back up in life, right? One of them clearly viewed. Now, I don't want to hammer on Lot too much. I will say this. Lot chose for himself the better part, as we say. I don't want to hammer too much in that Abraham did say what? Hey, let's have no strife. You choose. But Lot, who had been quite blessed, he could have said, because I've been blessed, I've been well blessed by the Lord. You choose. He could have. Somebody's got to choose. I understand that, so I want to hammer Lot too much, but I do want to elevate Abram that much for obvious reasons. Maybe they should have fought about it. And when I say fought about it, I mean fought in a different way. Let me give you an example. Talking about love. I generally say to younger, just because they're usually younger. I've done weddings of people in their 50s. I've done weddings of people in their 60s. I was scheduled to do a wedding recently of 2 people in their early 80s before one of them pulled out and decided to not go into that. And those are different circumstances in the conversations that you have leading up to the wedding. But that's not the usual weddings that you're asked to do. And so when we're sitting there and we're looking at maybe a young couple, very young, more often than not, I've probably missed it somewhere here or there, I will talk to them about being competitive in their marriage. Now, that word sounds interesting if you're advising them to be competitive in their marriage. Somebody goes, wait a minute, that doesn't sound like very good marital counseling. Shouldn't they not be competitive? Well, I talk about that side, the ugly side. In other words, let's compete to get our way. I'm going to compete to have my way. You're going to compete against me to get your way. No, we talk about that, and that's not a recommendation. But I tell them that marriages that last are highly competitive in one way. I'm going to outlove you today. No, you're not. Oh, no, you're not. Yeah, you just watch me. Okay, it's on. Let's go. This competition's on. I'm going to outlove you today. How? How so? I'm going to seek your interest above my own. Oh, no. I'm going to seek your... You get two people falling all over themselves to outlove the other one, those things last. That's what I'm talking about. Why didn't they compete here in a giving up mode, in a love mode? Because love is very much a giving up of self. They didn't. But one did. One just didn't even want to make it a competition. It was the ultimate giving up. If I'm going to love neighbor well, I'm going to be selfless. And notice that he took blessing, potentially, he took his blessing into account. I've been blessed enough to give up. So skip on down. After saying in verse 8, hey, let's not do this. Let's not have this strife. You separate and you choose, verse 9. Lot makes his choice. By the way, isn't it interesting in verse 10 that as Lot makes his choice, he makes it to go in a direction that we learn much more about later, do we not? Where did he pitch his tent? Toward Sodom. And we learn then about, I'm going to tell you, it's just me. Not a lot of coincidence there. I find it hard. This is just me. I find it hard not to at least wonder, if not go even further and think, is it selfishness that puts someone into a situation they think that is going to be so wonderful that turns out to be their biggest detriment? So we learn that about Lot later. So we see his choice in verse 11. We see Abram's decision and where he lands in verse 12. Or excuse me, Lot. Abraham dwelled in the land of Canaan. Lot, they're both mentioned in verse 12. But look at verse 14. Look at what the Lord does. Look at what the Lord gives. Now, listen, I'm not here this morning to suggest love neighbor by being selfless, love neighbor by giving up so that you can get more. But I'm not going to ignore what's in the text either. This is not the reason. Man, that Abraham, he was sharp. He was a shrewd negotiator. He knew from previous blessings given by God into his life, I bet if I do this, I'll get more. Do you ever know anybody that sort of gave himself up, somebody else in the Old Testament that sort of gave himself up in a different way and wound up coming out way ahead? Well, Job. as human as he absolutely was, that finally had him ask, finally, but we're way deep into the book, almost to the end of the book when he says, why? But in all this, what does Scripture say? And I just gave you the words. In all this, Job did not sin. And look how that book ends. What do we learn about that Job, who in all that did not sin? There was something he was not going to give up. He was going to continue to give self up. He was not going to give up his faith in his God. And what do we learn about Job at the close of the book? He didn't just have things restored, yes, and then some. God has always rewarded selflessness. Now, we don't always see the reward. We don't see it instantaneously. We don't see it at all. It's not a guarantee that it's going to look like something in particular. It's not always going to be financial or material in gain or popularity or one of these things that we automatically assign with reward, the word reward. But God always has or always will. And look what happens toward the close of the chapter. Verse 14. Lift your eyes now. This isn't Abraham to Lot. This is God to Abraham. Lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are. You look in every direction, he says, close of verse 14. In everything you see, verse 15, you and your descendants, verse 16. I'm giving it to you. It's all yours. I'm not saying, hey, I'm telling you, if you'll love your neighbor this way, you'll get more. But I'm not going to ignore the obvious, evident, multiple passages throughout Scripture where this kind of thing is shown. I want our focus to be on how God views that and how He obviously viewed it. But I want our focus to be on how God views it, but for the right reason. Is it possible Abraham is blessed in the way he is because of how he is? This is a good way to love neighbor. It may be that I get more opportunity with neighbor for things that really matter later when at least they have seen me as humble and selfless and seeking their interest. To then hear something I really want them to hear. Take on something I wish they'd take on. Get better in some area that needs improvement. This is how to love neighbor. So I told Don Spicer, Don, if you can hear me, yeah, thank you. There we go. All right. I was trying to get this thing on or off. Way back in 20 or 21, I think it was a Sunday night lesson. I don't know. It doesn't matter. I preached this lesson. And I want us to move into some different thoughts now on another way to love neighbor. And it deals with, as you can see from the title slide on that day, it deals with our reactions to our neighbor, with our neighbor. And I think I do believe the things that are in this lesson are true, needful, for your consideration, regardless of who that neighbor is or how that neighbor is. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands because some of y'all may live in the same neighborhood. Let me repeat that because you may have missed it. It's worth saying twice. Let's not have a show of hands. You ever had a bad neighbor? Now, what most of y'all can't see, because you're all looking one way, but I'm looking this way, is nonverbal communication. It wasn't this. Yes. But here, I won't tell you who, but a few in the room for sure. And the only reason I say a few and not several or most or at least many is because I can only see so many at a time, reacted to that. It is not just good practical advice from some self-help book or counselors. The Bible said it first, as said on the slide. We should remember that mastering our reactions can greatly reduce problems and greatly bless the work of God's people on earth. Now, what's one of the works of God's people on earth? It's to be evangelistic. It's to be salt and light. It's to better, it's to have impact. It's to better the lives around us. We hopefully are able to get into those spiritual considerations, that spiritual betterment, but it's to be salt and light. It's to preserve or to show a path. Salt preserve something, keep things from maybe moving in the wrong direction, or lighting a path. Giving seasoning, salt gives seasoning to life. And our reactions with people can enhance that opportunity or impede it. And sometimes just one reaction can enhance or impede. I'm not saying it ought to be that way. Everybody has a reaction occasionally that they shouldn't have. If I was to say a show of hands, I'm not asking for that. Let's not worry. Again, I'll beg you, let's not worry about a show of hands. I'll tell you why. It's because I don't want anybody to lie. But I could say, raise your hand if you've ever become angry. Raise your hand if you've ever lost your temper. Now, maybe that fleshes out in some different way. Maybe the way it fleshed out with brother so-and-so or sister so-and-so is not exactly how it fleshed out with this brother so-and-so or sister so-and-so, but you know what I'm talking about. I could say, raise your hand if you've ever been impatient. I could say, raise your hand if you ever had a thought you shouldn't have had, spoken a word you shouldn't have spoken. Wouldn't have spoken if you looked to your right and Jesus was sitting right there, even though Jesus was sitting right there. So we're not going to worry about a show of hands, but let's just be honest about our occasional reactions out of humanity. We're people. I've always loved this phrase, the best of people are people at best. It's true. And our reactions can enhance the opportunity to or impede the opportunity to love neighbor. Love by seeking their interest. Our reactions can forever impede or forever enhance the opportunity. I'm not saying it ought to be that way. Even that person who has viewed your reaction, listened to your words, seen your temper, whatever it might be, noticed that you jumped to some assumption that was not correct. You shouldn't have assumed without information. They see that, and even though they've done that before themselves, yes, they have, they utilize that as a means to not provide that opportunity to you anymore. to love and be salt and light. Please remember that our adversary is working in the lives of other people to impede relationship and opportunity. Please remember that there are some people, especially as it relates to God's will and placing themselves willfully under that harness, even though Jesus said, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." Yeah, but if I place myself under that yoke, by the way, do you know what that, is there a Bible word? Can you think of a potential Bible word that has to do with willfully placing yourself under a yoke, maybe like oxen would do? And be steered, allow yourself to be steered and moved in the direction that God would want you to go instead by your will, not my will, but thine be done. Instead of in the direction you would have pulled. Do you know of any word in Scripture that would bring that idea forth? I'll tell you, it's there. It's meek. Meek. Meekness. Paul opens one chapter by saying, "In the meekness and gentleness of Christ, I urge you to," and he goes on to say the things that he urges them to consider and be and do. We know meekness can't mean weakness because he describes Jesus. There's a hymn probably in our book, it's in a lot of books. Jesus, meek and gentle is the title of the hymn. So we know meekness doesn't mean weakness, though society kind of has adopted that view. And our abilities to choose to allow ourselves to be harnessed, considering our reactions, rather than to pull in a most natural way, human nature way, will go a long way toward the ability to love. Proverbs backs this up. Keep your heart with all diligence. By the way, the heart, that passage is not referencing cardiovascular health. It's not referencing a heart-healthy diet. I'm not saying the Bible's not for that. Stewardship means a lot of things, including stewardship of our bodies. But that passage is not discussing the ticker. That passage is talking about the mind. When Scripture uses heart, it's usually talking about the mind. Keep your mind. Harness yourself. Allow yourself. Keep that in check with all diligence. Why does he say that? What comes next, do you know? For out of that come the issues of life. How many of our issues, he's got issues, she's got issues. How many of our issues are self-inflicted? Now I could ask for a show of hands there if you've ever dealt with or had to, or if you're still are you dealing with now a self-inflicted wound, a self-inflicted issue? But let's not show hands because I don't want anybody to lie. Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of this spring the issues of life. Keep your mind. That's Proverbs 4. Proverbs 12, a fool's wrath is known immediately, but a prudent man covers shame. A fool's wrath is known immediately. We live in a world which says, well, I'd give him a piece of my mind if I were you. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands if you've ever given anybody a piece of your mind. That's the initial urge. Proverbs 16:32, he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who, look at this, he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. Who's better than the mighty? He who rules his spirit. Is that easy? Is it easy to rule your spirit? No. Proverbs 29:11, a fool vents all his feelings, a wise man holds them back. Questions to ask when we feel like we're wronged with a neighbor Someone else? Because we answered the question earlier, right? Who is my neighbor? Of course, the parable was given. Who is my neighbor? And the answer was yes. And that's the answer, yes. Do I have opportunity here? Do I have opportunity with this person? Well, then he's my neighbor. And this is why I started with Abraham and Lot, because there was strife. There was strife. Questions to ask when feeling wronged and prone to act. We need to remember these things before we act, because we're trying to love our neighbor. Is this thing rumor or real? Have you ever reacted to something as reality that you found out later was not reality? Ever? Or maybe you weren't on this side of it, you were on this side of it. Maybe you didn't react to what you thought was reality and it turned out it wasn't. Maybe somebody reacted toward you because they thought it was reality and they had to find out later that was not true. Maybe they came back later and apologized. Hope so. Has that ever happened in life, one way or the other, one side or the other of this equation for you? It's important to know. Hey, is this thing rumor or real? That's important to know. I'd ask that question because it could impede being able to love your neighbor. You could lose further opportunity. This thing, let's say it's real. Let's just go ahead and assume. I want on each of these questions to assume the worst or assume the yes. Okay, it's real. Well, is this thing that's real, is it a broken egg or a broken leg? Well, you know the answer to that, right? You know how to tell? The human nature way to tell is, did it happen to me? If it happened to me, it's a leg. Happens to somebody else, it may very well just be an egg. And I'd counsel them that way. Hey, John, are you sure this isn't just a broken egg? I can see that it might just be an egg when it happens to somebody else. When it happens to me, that's the definition of a leg, right? It's kind of like surgery. Major surgery is anything on me, right? So we need to ask that question. Now, is this thing rumor or is it real? And even if it's real, is it really a broken leg or is it more just like a broken egg if I would think just a little bit longer before I react? Because, see, I don't want to lose opportunity for further opportunity with this, of impacting the life of this neighbor. Okay, let's say it is a leg. It's real and it's a leg. Well, was it an inherent wrong toward you, or was it just an inconvenience upon you? I think I'd ask that question. I was targeted. They were going after me. They were intentionally trying to hurt me. Me. I think I'd ask that question because it'll drive response. Did Jesus ever say anything about our response? By your words you will be judged, and by your words you will be condemned. Jesus says, I'll tell you the truth, for every careless word men say, they will give account of in the day of judgment. Do you know what the word careless, rendered careless, in some translations means? In that, depending on your translation, many will say careless. Do you know what the word actually means in the Greek language? It refers to what we call popping off. So every time somebody pops off, hey, that's only human. We've all done it, just popped off in a frustration. He says, every time I pop off, I'm going to give an account of that in the day of judgment. That's there. It's in the text. So I think I'd ask that question. And one more on this slide, and we'll pick up from here next week in this lesson. Let's say it's yes. It's real. It's a broken leg. It was an inherent wrong purpose toward me. Was it done out of malice, or was it just a mistake? I think I'd ask that question. Because my reaction can impede my opportunity to love my neighbor in the next opportunity. I may not get the next opportunity because of an unnecessary, even unwarranted sometimes, reaction. I think I'd ask those questions. And there's more to consider, and we'll consider all that more next week. Thank you for being here. This is your week to love your neighbor.